Well, the two cases that I am asking you to read for this week, um, 10-5, Public Health and Safety, Observing Offsite Safety Issues, and 08-10, Public Welfare Design of Medical Equipment. Like last week's case, I would say that they're first canon cases. That is, cases that have to do with the first canon of the NSPE Code of Ethics. Engineers shall hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. We are relying on in the first half of this course on the Board of Ethical Review. We're looking at these cases. We'll be doing some different sort of approach in the second half of the course, but we're looking at the Board of Ethical Review, which is real people giving their reasoned opinion about, either real or realistic scenarios that engineers have been involved in. And that's good. I personally think it's the best way to approach engineering ethics, looking at actual cases, looking at moral reasoning about those cases, decisions that have come to. And the Board of Ethical Review is a very valuable resource. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a central resource for engineering ethics. But that's not to say that it's always consistent or correct. I mean, that's for you to decide. The Board of Ethical Review is made up of real people. It's been around for a long time, since the 1950s. So who knows how many times its membership has changed. So, it may be that it's not always consistent in what it says. And that's okay. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not a real fault, because human beings are not consistent in their moral opinions or their moral reasonings. Not all the moral conclusions they come to are compatible with each other. And, that's just the way it is, which is not to say that either of these opinions are wrong in their conclusions. But, it's an interesting contrast to last week's case, the first case we read about the engineer who was faced with a decision about his client presenting facts to the public which were at odds with his own professional judgment. This week's cases, the conclusions that are made are not as clear cut and different. I mean, last week there was a conclusion that engineer had a duty, had an obligation to let it be known that the information that was being put out by his client was at odds with his own findings. One could say that was an example of whistleblowing, blowing the whistle, which just means coming out to the public with information that you think that they need to know about your client, about your employer, about whoever you work for. So, in any case, these decisions are different and instructive, very instructive. Let's start with the other one. Let's start with, I can find it. Oh. Yeah, let's start with this one, public health and safety. What is going on? Can't seem to scroll down. Here we go. Okay. All right, so we have an engineer who's working on a construction site who observes something amiss in an adjacent site, observes potential safety issues relating to the performance of work by a subcontractor on a project being constructed on an adjacent piece of property. That is, in the course of their work, they observe that there is a serious safety issue or potential safety issue at an adjacent site. The site they're not working on, they have no connection with it. They just observe it in the course of the day. And the question is, what are their ethical obligations under the circumstances, right? That is, you're living your life, and you're doing your job. And then you see something which, as an engineer, you're especially qualified to notice is amiss. You have no direct relation to the situation. You just have the knowledge. And the question is, what, if any, are your obligations under those circumstances? I think it's quite, I mean, read the decision, right? But it's quite interesting what they say and why they conclude, I think. It's interesting why they conclude what they do, which is that, well, these engineers should bring this potential safety issue to the attention of their supervisor and their client, but that they have no obligation to do anything else. That perhaps they don't have an obligation to do even that. They say engineers A should bring this potential safety issue. They don't say must. So the word should is kind of ambiguous morally. You should do it, but that doesn't really indicate, to my mind, whether or not it's morally obligatory or simply something that would be good to do. They point out that there's no imminent danger. That is, if there were an imminent danger, if somebody was in imminent peril, that is, was directly in danger because of what they observed, it would be a different thing. But because they're judging that it's not, the engineer does not have an obligation to report this issue beyond his superiors. So I guess they're saying he does have an obligation to inform his superiors, but nothing else. That is, if they don't do anything about it, he doesn't have any further obligation. It's not his personal responsibility to make sure that that problem is addressed. And what are the reasons for saying that? The last paragraph is very interesting, and it really gives you a sense of kind of the larger agenda of the Board of Ethical Review. Right? The last paragraph says, having said that, actually, above that is good. The second to last paragraph. They start this way. They say this: as a general rule, it's right here, an engineer cannot be expected to take on personal or professional responsibility for each and every potential health and safety risk they may be exposed to during the course of a day, which are essentially unrelated to the services for which the engineer is being professionally engaged. To impose such a responsibility upon an engineer could thrust the engineer into a never-ending scope of activities that are beyond what is reasonable and could expose the engineer to unlimited personal and professional liability. And then they end the discussion by saying, to do otherwise would make engineer A accountable for a wide range of public duties and responsibilities that are beyond the bounds of reason. Very interesting, and something to think about. That is, if they were to conclude that this engineer had an ethical duty to make sure that that problem at the adjacent site was corrected, their judgment is that this would impose an unreasonable burden upon all engineers, which would mean that they had an obligation to do something about everything that they observed in the course of life. Everything that in an incidental way they observed. That is, that whenever they saw a safety problem or something amiss, whether they were directly involved or not, that to say they had a duty to do something about it, that this would create a never-ending scope of activities that are beyond what is reasonable. So you can see that when I said agenda, the larger agenda, they're trying to delimit the first canon duties here, right? They're trying to draw what they regard to be a reasonable limit upon the kind of obligations that an engineer has to protect the public. To decide, I guess, that in this case the engineer didn't have an obligation to see things through, not just to report to their supervisors, but to see the thing through to make sure that the public was protected, and the public may just be the workers at the adjacent site. That would impose an unreasonable burden on the engineer, a never-ending scope of activities. So whether you agree with it, I don't know. Interesting. So next video, we will look at the other case, which also is interesting.